Welcome back. You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. My name is Brendan Cole. A Turkish man has staged an 8-hour silent vigil in Istanbul's Taksim Square, the scene of violent clashes between police and anti-government protesters. His protest has inspired many others and comes after Turkey's Deputy Prime Minister raised the role of the armed forces intervening in protests that have swept cities throughout the country. The protests have presented the Prime Minister Tayyip Erdogan with his biggest challenge to his 10-year leadership. So what began late in May as a protest by environmentalists upset at government plans to build on a public park that adjoined Taksim Square has grown into a movement against Erdogan, who opponents say is overbearing and meddles in their personal lives. Well, to discuss the protests in Turkey, I'm pleased to be joined in the studio by Fadi Hakura. He's Associate Fellow and Manager of the Turkey Project at Chatham House. Also here in the studio is Dr. Tunç Aybak, who's Programme Coordinator of International Relations at Middlesex University. He's also Advisor at the Centre for Turkey Studies. Also here in the studio is Michael Binyon. He's a Foreign Affairs Specialist for the Times newspaper. And on the line from Istanbul, we have Ayla Cinyakli. She's a journalist for Reuters and has been covering Turkey for more than a decade. Ayla, I'll start with you. You're in Istanbul. What's the latest that you've heard? We've heard these comments from the Deputy Prime Minister with the spectre possibly of some kind of military involvement. Is there any further word on that?
No, that was a report from yesterday, a statement that the Deputy Prime Minister, Bülent Arınç, made yesterday, and we haven't heard any subsequent follow-up comments to that. It was a conditional statement that he said that at present the police are doing their jobs. If need be, we would call in elements of the armed forces if the situation were to arise. As far as we know anyway, there's been no steps in that direction.
And there's also been criticism of the use of tear gas in these protests. Erdogan himself has commented about the tear gas. I mean, what is he saying about that? What's his justification?
Well, he's pointing out that the use of tear gas in some ways, has replaced potentially more brutal, from their perspective, maybe more brutal action against civilian protesters. It's something that I'd noticed as well in the way that they were trying to control the riots. There has been some, physical contact, but it's been limited. There hasn't been the use of batons, say, by police. So I think that the way that they view the use of tear gas to control the protests, they feel that it maybe takes the place of some even more brutal action.
So is there the fear that more brutal methods may possibly be used in the coming days and weeks?
I don't think that there's really an expectation that would happen. I think that the expectation would be that if these protests do continue, that it'd be more of the same, that tear gas would still be the main form in which they try to control the protests.
It felt like the protests started relatively spontaneously. Is there a sense that they're becoming more organised now?
It's correct. It very much began as a spontaneous movement, but over the course of the last several weeks, there has been efforts to organize, mainly through the use of social media, obviously through Twitter, through Facebook, as well as other forms. And from what we're seeing, that seems to be the main. Those seem to continue to be the main organizing tools for people. There are calls for action on Facebook and on Twitter again.
And what about the nature of the protesters themselves? We in the West have been reading these reports of the protesters gathering, or the protests themselves gathering pace. What do we have? We have environmentalists. Do we have anarchists, Alevis, women? Who are they?
They're an incredibly diverse group of people, remarkably so, actually. And many of them actually have quite differing views of where they'd like to see Turkey and which direction they'd like to see it move, which has been what makes it so remarkable that they've been able to work together when they come from such different political backgrounds. We've seen students, we've seen Kemalists or soft nationalists, we've seen deeply religious people, Islamists there, who call themselves anti-capitalist Muslims. We've seen Kurds, we've seen Alevis. It's a microcosm of Turkey in many ways, just as Turkey is quite a diverse nation. So has been this protest.
Fadi Hakura, Associate Fellow and Manager of the Turkey Project at Chatham House. What kind of impact does this have on the image of Turkey?
I think that these the protests have damaged Turkey's international reputation and its domestic reputation, especially the halo that was held toward the Prime Minister of Turkey, Recep Tayyip Erdogan. And I think that it's going to be incredibly difficult for him, if not nearly impossible, for him to restore the positive image that he enjoyed both internationally and domestically.
Tunç Aybak, The people who are protesting against him are not necessarily conservatives, are they? And he has a widespread support amongst conservatives in Turkey, and he has won, let's face it, 3 elections in a democratic country.
That's absolutely right. But yes, he has won elections and he has a broad support. But I think these events have changed the entire context of Turkish politics, in the sense that government now increasingly looks out of touch and dated, out of touch with the young people, even the opposition. I mean, let's get an accurate picture here that these protests were not against, its protests were mainly against old establishment, and they look like old establishment. And they were also very careful to detach themselves from the Republican People's Party. Then, because they were not happy with the opposition. Opposition failed to translate the demands of these young, dynamic people into politics. So what unites them, if you think about the makeup, is that the common concerns, not the political affiliations, common concerns about Turkey's future. They wanted to reclaim the common ground in politics as well, because politics has been narrowing gradually since Erdogan came to power.
Michael Binyon from The Times. The comments from Erdogan were interesting. He says, they say the Prime Minister is harsh. If you call this harshness, I'm sorry, but this is Tayyip Erdogan. But this Tayyip Erdogan won't change. He's unrepentant. Do you think he's being too defiant?
Almost certainly, yes. I think it's extremely damaging to him. He's always been known to have a very thin skin. He's a man of a very prickly temperament, and he doesn't take kindly to criticism of any kind, either from allies or friends, or indeed from others in his own party. And I think he feels personally challenged and threatened. I think he sees his enemies gathering pace. He has had really unparalleled power in Turkey, and he is ambitious to become an executive president. He wants to change the constitution. Now, I think this is going to very much damage that possibility and hurt his political chances. And I think, as we've heard, his image has been damaged at home and abroad. And I think the really damaging thing is the criticism from Europe, and possibly we may see some tougher words coming from his big friend in America, Obama.
Back to you, Ayla Jean-Yakli in Istanbul. Ostensibly these protests started from environmentalists, I suppose. It seems to have morphed into criticism with regard to the changes in the constitution. There's also a tougher line being fought against the sale of alcohol and whatnot. I mean, it's a very broad base of complaints against Erdogan, isn't it? And do you think that detracts perhaps from a degree of unanimity among the protesters as to what they want?
It does complicate it, certainly, that there isn't one unified goal that they all seek. But in some ways, it also strengthens, I think, the protests, in that they can attract people from a wide range of political views who have different concerns about where they see the country heading. So in some ways, it actually has allowed it to gain more traction and attract larger numbers of people than it may have if it were just simply about the development of a park and several hundred trees.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London with me, Brendan Cole. We're discussing the protests in Turkey. With me in the studio is Fadi Hakura, Associate Fellow and Manager of the Turkey Project at Chatham House think tank, Dr. Tunç Aybak, Programme Coordinator of International Relations at Middlesex University and Advisor at the Centre for Turkey Studies, Michael Binyon, Foreign Affairs Specialist for the Times newspaper, and on the line from Istanbul, Ayla Jean-Yakli, a journalist for Reuters and has been covering Turkey for more than a decade. A difficulty, Fadi Hakura, for the Western community and how they're going to react, because effectively we have somebody who is a democratically legitimate leader of a democratic country. Does it really matter if he's liberal or not?
I think that it does matter, because Turkey is not a monolithic society. It's a very diverse society in terms of ethnicity, political ideology, and language. So it is important to have a liberal prime minister or a liberal leadership which has a philosophy that can accommodate this diversity. But what we are seeing now in Turkey is that democracy, for the first time, is maturing on its own without outside interference, either by the European Union or by interference from the military. And I think that in the long term will strengthen Turkish democracy and accountability in Turkish society.
Tunç Aybak, do you think that there's not really consensus building within Turkey? Erdogan is not really he's not brooking any kind of dissent, is he?
His confrontational style is not helping. Instead of engaging with a constructive dialogue, he's polarizing the society. In fact, these recent events have revealed the deep fault lines within the society, and this is a worrying thing. I mean, he came to power with a promise to transform the Turkish society, talked about deep state. He came to power against this deep state, but he's effectively using the state to exercise his authority. Strict regulations over social media and the use, the mentioning army as a last resort. These are worrying signs.
But in terms of the economy, Turkey's a success story. It's now the 17th biggest economy in the world. There's been almost, not quite, but double-digit growth for 2010, 2011. The lot of the average person in Turkey, financially at least, has improved. That counts for a lot. Absolutely. I agree. He has. The growth is there. He has actually, contributed to the growth. But when we look at this, over the years, actually the gap between rich and poor has widened. Instead of serving the wider society's interests and demands, what he has done, he actually favored his own business elite and his own business interests. When we look at the people, these demonstrators, they're young. Most of them are female. There were lots of female protesters there. Unemployment among the Turkish young female population is very high. Of course, this is not about economic rights, but also the unemployment rate, again, amongst the young people is very high. This economic model has not really trickled down. Do you agree with that, Fadi Hakura? I mean, comparisons are being drawn with Arab Spring countries, and a lot of what was the impetus for that was economic disenfranchisement. People in Turkey are financially better off than they were 20 years ago. Erdogan has been successful.
No doubt that Turkey has enjoyed moderately high growth rates of on average of 5.2% GDP growth rate per year of the last decade. But the days of these kind of growth rates are over. Turkey enjoyed these growth rates via macroeconomic stability and lowering inflation and lowering interest rates. Now, for Turkey to enjoy these kind of growth rates, it has to undertake some major structural reforms. And we have seen recently, and that looks unlikely to happen under this government or any time in the near future. If we look in 2012, growth in Turkey went down to 2.2%, from 9% in 2011 to 2.2%. And this year, Turkey will be lucky to achieve anywhere from 3 to 3.5% of gross domestic product. So the days of easy growth in Turkey are now truly over.
Michael, I mean, what do you think about the political opposition? Do you think that there is an effective one that can really represent the grievances of those people who are in the streets?
No, I don't think they can at all. And I think that's one of the things that is driving the protesters, the feeling of no one to represent them. Certainly, I don't think the Republican People's Party is really an effective force. They have been defeated again and again, and their base is dwindling. They also are looking somewhat backwards in their ideology. I don't think they're very much in tune with what modern people want. They're not in tune with the internet generation, as it were. And I think we're seeing the same phenomenon as we saw in Egypt, say. We have a government that has been in power unchallenged, really, for quite a long time, a really ineffective opposition, and people with grievances feeling that they have to take to the streets to make their voice heard, and alternative kinds of politics, internet politics, social media, things of this kind, which established politicians really don't understand. I think Erdogan understands it very well. He looks at the example of what happened in Egypt, and he doesn't want that sort of thing happening in his own country. And if you look further north, there are great similarities between Erdogan and Putin. A similar worry about opposition that is effective only really through social media.
Ayla Cinyakli in Istanbul, there was a comment made by an Oxford academic, Kerim Oktum. He made the point, actually, touched on there. Erdogan looks increasingly like Hosni Mubarak before his fall. What do you think of that comment?
I think it's extremely unlikely. I don't think that Erdogan is teetering on the brink or anything like that. I know that for some people, Mubarak's departure was sudden when it happened. So these things are very fluid and they're difficult to predict. But I don't see that happening here. As we've been discussing, there are no real alternatives, at least among the protesters even, to Erdogan. A common refrain that I heard while talking with people from all political stripes in the park. Again, soft nationalists, hard leftists, environmentalists, liberals, all these different kinds of people. They said the same thing, and I know that there'll be differing views on this as well. But what the refrain that I heard most often was, "We don't want Erdogan to go. We want him to change." And the main reason for that is they don't see alternative that they could really rally around, partly because of their different views, that it isn't a cohesive opposition. And they also, I think, maybe are a bit nostalgic for the reformist Erdogan of 5, 6, 7 years ago.
Fadi Hakura, well, they want him to change, they don't want him to go, but they also want an opposition. There's no viable opposition. That's a massive stumbling block, isn't it?
That is no doubt true. Nevertheless, I think that with time, perhaps in 5, 10 years, we really can't say, that these protests and the views and the implication of these protests may begin to filter into the opposition. One should not completely ignore the opposition. I mean, you still have the Republican People's Party. It may not be the best possible opposition, but there is a potential for change within the party. But of course, all of these things do take time, and especially in Turkey's case, will take time.
The most recent polls out show that 35% of people would still vote for Erdogan's party if an election were to be held straight away. In April, it was 36.3%. Not much of a difference. So I'm wondering how much of a difference among his supporters. It has made no difference among his supporters in the heartland. Really, are we over-egging this? Is it too much of an exaggeration to say his support has slumped?
Let's put this in a perspective. First of all, there is no challenge to his legitimacy. Majority of these protesters do not question his legitimacy. He's an elected leader. What they want from Erdogan is to sort of respect their rights, because Erdogan is trying to carve a society in his conservative image. They want to exercise their rights. They want the minority rights to be respected. It is not about, the governmental change. And this is actually going to have an impact, not immediately. These young protesters are learning politics. They're learning how to organize protests. There'll be young politicians, there'll be new formations, and this will have an impact on the opposition party, but also it will impact the structure of Erdogan's party as well. So there might be some changes because Erdogan's leadership is not unquestionable anymore.
Interesting in terms of the Western approach to this, Michael Binyon. The European Union Enlargement Commissioner, Stefan Füle, expressed concern about what's happening in Turkey, and negotiations to join the European Union have stalled. Just in terms of Turkey's European Union accession, I suppose a lot of leaders in Europe will be thinking, well, this is exactly why Turkey shouldn't join the European Union.
Well, some are, certainly, yes. I think there are two schools of thought about this. One is that Turkey has been a very successful country. It has been economically extremely successful. It is playing a pivotal role in the region. It is a beacon of stability, or was certainly, for other Muslim countries looking to set up a mildly Islamic government. And everybody has felt that Turkey has always been this vital bridge between East and West. And for that reason, there are strategic reasons for wanting it inside Europe. But at the same time, I think there is, yes, renewed worries that Turkey may slip back into the kind of polarized society and polarized politics that we saw 20 or 30 years ago, when you had army interventions and you had a real hardcore leftist element that was essentially fighting a sort of guerrilla war against the state. And I think there is worry that that may return.
Fadi Hakura, you wrote in a Chatham House paper, it was in November 2011, that Erdogan was determined Turkey be a leading player in the Middle East and North Africa. Now, I know a lot has happened since then, but these protests, do you think that this will have an impact on how Turkey is a bridge between East and West, as we heard there?
I think that even prior to the protest, Turkey ceased to be a mediating country and became an activist country, in the sense that it used to try to mediate. It had good relations with Israel, with the Arab states, with the United States and Europe. But in recent times, Erdogan has shifted to becoming an activist for the Palestinian cause. He's become an activist for other Islamic causes. Increasingly, Turkey is now not being seen as the major power, an important power in the Middle East, but not the major power in the Middle East.
But a very significant player with the conflict in Syria, and especially given that hundreds of thousands of refugees are pouring over the Turkish border. He's in a conundrum there, isn't he? Because he opposes Assad. He wants to see a resolution to this, and Turkey is the key player in the region.
I think that on Syria in particular, Prime Minister Erdogan's policy on Syria is extremely unpopular in Turkish society, according to several opinion polls. In addition, also, he is stymied on Syria because he has completely miscalculated on the durability of President Assad. His influence in Syria is not as great as he made out to be originally, and increasingly the momentum on Syria is not in Ankara, but is essentially in Moscow, in Washington, London, and Paris.
Tunç Aybak.
I think Turkey has lost its honest broker role in the Middle East. Turkey had the potential to play that role, but because of this aligning its politics along the sectarian lines hasn't helped. In fact, the Syrian conflict, it seems that the Syrian conflict is going to increasingly spill over into Turkey. As you know, there are Alawites in Turkey. 10 to 15% of the Turkish population are Alawites. So this policy is undermining actually the long-term objectives of Turkey's foreign policy action.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. We're discussing the protests in Turkey with Fadi Hakura, Tunç Aybak, Michael Binyon and Ayla Jean-Yakli. Ayla Jean-Yakli, difficult for the European Union and for Barack Obama to really go too hard and criticise Erdogan, given that they want to see democracy installed in countries that have been affected by the Arab Spring. And I mean, what will the stance be, do you think, in terms of how Barack Obama and how the West criticise Erdogan?
Well, there's been quite a bit of criticism, hasn't there, out of Europe. There was a pretty strong resolution condemning the use of excessive force by the European Parliament, but one that Prime Minister Erdogan said he didn't recognize. There was also reports in the Turkish press today that a series of meetings with European officials have been cancelled. So there's concern that this is undermining Turkey's European Union quest. However, that's seemingly been on the back burner for a long time anyway. So it doesn't actually feel like there's any great change there. It's hard for me to say, what we can expect on this from Washington. They've been measured so far. Washington has been measured so far in their criticism of his handling. They have talked about their concerns and the right for these protesters to meet and to protest, but they obviously, so much more goes into the calculation for Washington. I mean, especially with vis-a-vis Syria. So I feel like they've got a lot more on their plate than just these protests when considering Turkey.
Fadi Hakura, there were some relatively encouraging words from Abdullah Öcalan, the jailed leader of the Kurdistan Workers' Party, the PKK, as he called for a historic truce. He said, let guns be silent and politics dominate. I'm wondering where this puts the chance of peace between the Kurds and the Turkish government.
I think that the chances of peace between the Turkish state, or the Turkish government, and the PKK, or the Kurdistan Workers' Party, looked fragile even prior to the protests. Prime Minister Erdogan is highly unlikely to deliver the political concessions and economic concessions that are needed to resolve the Kurdish issue in Turkey. He has not even prepared the Turkish public for the kind of concessions that need to be made to resolve this long-standing problem. I think that there is a feeling that Prime Minister Erdogan entered into these talks with Abdullah Öcalan for political reasons. For example, to try to have a majority in the parliament to change the constitution towards an executive presidency, and as well as perhaps to maintain the peace in Turkey, a peaceful environment in Turkey, so he can have the maximum advantage to win the presidential elections in August next year.
You're confident, or you think that he will be a key factor and he will win those presidential elections?
It's very difficult at the moment to say. Still, I think Prime Minister Erdogan is still the most popular politician in Turkey, but since those protests, it's no longer a foregone conclusion that he will win the presidential elections next year.
Well, maybe the incumbent, Abdullah Gül, will be emboldened to run for a second term, perhaps, in light of these protests. What do you think, Dr. Aybak?
Yeah, absolutely. Abdullah Gül is a rising politician. The way he managed this, his moderate style actually gained a lot of popularity. I wouldn't put my bet on Erdogan's super presidency now because the whole political context changed. And it's not going to be easy for him to do whatever he wants to do. I mean, even the constitutional reform is now going to be much more difficult to implement, to pass or implement even in the long run.
Michael Binyon, what can the international community do now? I mean, they can issue decrees, they can make strong words, but they've just got to wait and see, don't they?
Yes, I think actually they would be quite wise to temper their words for a while now. I mean, Erdogan reacts extremely badly to criticism, as we have heard. He's clearly aware that what he's done has caused annoyance and upset and worry among his partners and allies, but I think he would be infuriated by further criticism and would react very obstinately. I mean, there are some leaders who, if criticised, simply dig their heels in, and he's one of them. On the other hand, a fairly smart fellow, I mean, very smart, and he's obviously taken on board the criticism. It would be quite clever now to make concessions, having demonstrated that he's fully back in control. That's the time now when he makes any kind of concession. He already has made a sort of concession over the park itself.
That's right, because he's said that he's open to a referendum on the matter.
Yes.
So he does listen.
Oh, well, yes. I mean, what he wants to show is that negotiations and talks and things are on his terms, at his timing, with him in control, not pushed by the mob, as he sees it. And that, I think, above all, is what has driven him into this really confrontational style with the protesters.
So, Fadi, if he becomes president and he's not prime minister, what happens then?
If Prime Minister Erdogan becomes president, he'll leave a big vacuum in Turkish politics, because he's dominated pretty much Turkish politics for the last 10 years single-handedly. And I think that what he'll want to do if he becomes president is to engineer, to bring in a kind of uncharismatic politician to take over as prime minister, similar to what former Turkish President Turgut Özal did in the late 80s. Take over the prime minister, and then President Erdogan, if he becomes president, would try to run the government through such a prime minister.
So if that happens, I mean, Ayla Cinyakli in Istanbul, is there a feeling that Turkey could become even more conservative in the years to come? We've got some tougher rules on alcohol, on things like adultery. Is the fear that this is just going to become more conservative?
I don't know if there's anything on adultery that's planned right now. That was a reform that they tried to introduce several years ago, banning adultery. But
what about kissing in public? I think that was also on the agenda, wasn't it?
That was. It's nothing legislative. There just was a response to some public kissing that was protested, and there was some violence surrounding that protest. But it's fair to say that there are things in play that are making Turkey more conservative, and they seem to have the sponsorship of this government, and it shouldn't be of any great surprise. This is a conservative government. Turkey is a conservative country in many ways. What's been special about Turkey, of course, is that it's been able to balance those things, that it is a conservative country. People are religious, they are devout, and yet things like alcohol have been readily available. With a legislative change that was signed by the president this month, there's restrictions on the sales of alcohol that the government defends are in line with what we can see in European countries, that they aren't by any means extreme restrictions on the use of alcohol. But people have pointed at it as a sign that this government is trying to reshape secular Turkey, and I think that some of those concerns are legitimate. It's tweaking at the edges, mainly, as you mentioned too, a lot of what this protest was about, specifically the sense that while they may be in a minority today, those sort of secularist-minded Turks, they feel that their rights should be protected.
Well, sadly, we've run out of time. That's Ayla Cinyakli on the phone from Istanbul. She's a Reuters journalist who's been covering Turkey for more than 10 years. Also here in the studio, Michael Binion, Foreign Affairs Specialist for the Times newspaper, Dr. Tunç Aybak, Programme Coordinator of International Relations at Middlesex University and Advisor at the Centre for Turkey Studies. And here also in the studio is Fadi Hakura, Associate Fellow and Manager of the Turkey Project at Chatham House. Thank you all very much for joining me, Brendan Cole, on The Voice of Russia in London.
There has been efforts to organize, mainly through the use of social media, obviously through Twitter, through Facebook, as well as other forums. And from what we're seeing, those seem to continue to be the main organizing tools for people. There are calls for action on Facebook and on Twitter again.
And what about the nature of the protesters themselves? I mean, we in the West have been reading these reports of the protesters gathering, or the protests themselves gathering pace. What do we have? We have environmentalists. Do we have anarchists, Alevis, women? Who are they?
They're an incredibly diverse group of people, remarkably so, actually. And many of them actually have quite differing views of where they'd like to see Turkey and which direction they'd like to see it move, which has been what makes it so remarkable that they've been able to work together when they come from such different political backgrounds. We've seen students, we've seen Kemalist or soft nationalists, we've seen deeply religious people, Islamists there, who call themselves anti-capitalist Muslims. We've seen Kurds, we've seen Alevis. It's a microcosm of Turkey in many ways, just as Turkey is quite a diverse nation. So has been this protest.
Fadi Hakura, Associate Fellow and Manager of the Turkey Project at Chatham House. What kind of impact does this have on the image of Turkey?
I think that these the protests have damaged Turkey's international reputation and its domestic reputation, especially the halo that was held toward the Prime Minister of Turkey, Recep Tayyip Erdogan. And I think that it's going to be incredibly difficult for him, if not nearly impossible, for him to restore the positive image that he enjoyed both internationally and domestically.
Tunç Aybak, the people who are protesting against him are not necessarily conservatives, are they? And he has a widespread support amongst conservatives in Turkey, and he has won, let's face it, 3 elections in a democratic country.
That's absolutely right. But yes, he has won elections and he has a broad support. But I think these events have changed.
He was Programme Coordinator of International Relations at Middlesex University. He's also advisor at the Centre for Turkey Studies. Also here in the studio is Michael Binyon. He's a Foreign Affairs Specialist for the Times newspaper. And on the line from Istanbul, we have Ayla Jean Yakli. She's a journalist for Reuters and has been covering Turkey for more than a decade. Ayla, I'll start with you. You're in Istanbul. What's the latest that you've heard? We've heard these comments from the Deputy Prime Minister with the spectre possibly of some kind of military involvement. Is there any further word on that?
No, that was a report from yesterday, a statement that the Deputy Prime Minister, Bülent Arınç, made yesterday, and we haven't heard any subsequent follow-up comments to that. It was a conditional statement that he said that at present the police are doing their jobs. If need be, we would call in elements of the armed forces if the situation were to arise. As far as we know anyway, there's been no steps in that direction.
And there's also been criticism of the use of tear gas in these protests. Erdogan himself has commented about the tear gas. I mean, what is he saying about that? What's his justification?
Well, he's pointing out that the use of tear gas in some ways, has replaced potentially more brutal, from their perspective, maybe more brutal action against civilian protesters. It's something that I'd noticed as well in the way that they were trying to control the riots. There has been some, physical contact, but it's been limited. There hasn't been the use of batons, say, by police. So I think that the way that they view the use of tear gas to control the protests, they feel that it maybe takes the place of some even more brutal action.
So is there the fear that more brutal methods may possibly be used in the coming days and weeks?
I don't think that there's really an expectation that would happen. I think that the expectation would be that if these protests do continue, that it'd be more of the same, that tear gas would still be the main form in which they try to control the protests.
It felt like the protests started relatively spontaneously. Is there a sense that they're becoming more organised now?
It's correct. It very much began as a spontaneous movement, but over the course of the last several weeks.
Welcome back. You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. My name is Brendan Cole. A Turkish man has staged an 8-hour silent vigil in Istanbul's Taksim Square, the scene of violent clashes between police and anti-government protesters. His protest has inspired many others and comes after Turkey's Deputy Prime Minister raised the role of the armed forces intervening in protests that have swept cities throughout the country. The protests have presented the Prime Minister Tayyip Erdogan with his biggest challenge to his 10-year leadership. So what began late in May as a protest by environmentalists upset at government plans to build on a public park that adjoined Taksim Square has grown into a movement against Erdogan, who opponents say is overbearing and meddles in their personal lives. Well, to discuss the protests in Turkey, I'm pleased to be joined in the studio by Fadi Hakura. He's Associate Fellow and Manager of the Turkey Project at Chatham House. Also here in the studio is Dr. Tunç Aybak.